As you know, renewable fuels are a key element of our nation's strategy for addressing the serious challenge of global climate change. In his 2007 State of the Union address, the President proposed to reduce gasoline consumption by 20% through increased use of renewable and alternative fuels and through the promulgation of new vehicle efficiency standards. Although Congress did not enact all aspects of the President's 2010 plan, it did approve new renewable fuel and fuel economy standards as part of the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007. As the Chairman noted, when Congress approved the RFS program as part of the 2005 Energy Bill, the Environmental Protection Agency was charged with drafting regulations and implementing the new program. This responsibility was maintained in the 2007 Energy Law. Under Minister Johnson's direction now, we're conducting a broad outreach effort to discuss programmatic issues with multiple stakeholders regarding implementation of the 2000 Energy Law. We've had numerous meetings starting in January, less than a month after the enactment of ESA, and we've talked to individual refiners, refiner organizations, biofuel producers, feedstock providers, fuel distributors, downstream marketers, technical experts, and major environmental groups. And I would say active discussions and informational exchanges are also ongoing right now. EPA is also working very closely with our federal partners, the Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture, and others to go beyond the direct consultative roles that were contained in the legislation and to take advantage of external expertise and analytical capability. In this regard, we're certainly mindful of the present discussion and public debate on the matter of food versus fuel. Last week, the Chief Economist for the Department of Agriculture provided testimony to the Joint Economic Committee concerning the national and global increase in food prices and his analysis of the various factors involved. I am not going to provide any further illumination on his testimony, but I would note that our economic analysis to accompany the RFS rule will include an extensive review of the effects of the mandate on commodity prices, food prices, exports, cattle feed, and other factors. In addition, I would note, as has been noted already in this hearing, that the agency has received several requests related to our waiver authority, including a specific request by the Governor of Texas for EPA to waive the 50% of the mandate for the production of ethanol derived from grain. In response, it's our intent to shortly issue a Federal Register notice on this matter and establish a docket to receive public comments. EPA is required under the Clean Air Act to approve or disapprove a state petition within 90 days of receiving it. Overall, as the subcommittee well appreciates, ESA made significant changes in the RFS program, and developing implementing regulations for these provisions will require careful evaluation and considerable new analysis. I'll just briefly go through parts of the bill, but first, as already mentioned, ESA increased the total renewable fuel volume approximately fivefold over the 2005 Energy Bill, while extending the statutory schedule by 10 years. Second, ESA extended the RFS program to include both on-road and non-road gasoline and diesel fuel volumes. This change may affect new parties, possibly including a number of small businesses. Third, ESA increased the number of renewable fuel categories and standards to a total of 4, including total renewable fuel and 3 new subcategories, each with its own required minimum volumes: advanced biofuels, biomass-based diesel, and cellulosic fuels. Fourth, new provisions that are included in ESA require EPA to apply life cycle greenhouse gas performance standards to each category of renewable fuel. The agency, in coordination with DOE and USDA, has done a substantial amount of work on life cycle analysis over the past year. However, even with the advances that we've already made, additional new and improved analysis will be necessary. And fifth, ESA adds a number of other new provisions, including changing the definition of renewable fuel feedstocks and developing appropriate enforceable regulations on this provision is also going to require extensive dialogue with our interagency colleagues as well as stakeholders. Finally, as required also by Congress, we will be assessing the impacts of ESA on vehicle emissions, air quality, greenhouse gases, water quality, land use, and energy security. We believe these analyses will provide important information to the public and Congress on the effectiveness of the new legislation. So I'll stop there and be available for any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meyers. You probably heard the testimony of our previous witness, Representative Hersis Sandlin, concerning her legislation, which would qualify woody biomass taken from federal lands for the renewable fuel standard. And I have just a couple of questions for you concerning that. Do you believe that EPA has the flexibility under current law to provide for the permissibility for the use of woody biomass coming from federal lands under the renewable fuel standard?
Mr. Chairman, that's an issue in front of us in terms of the implementation of the legislative language, but the legislative language, I can pull it out, but refers directly to non-federal.
Well, so what is your conclusion from that?
The face of the language would prove difficult to not obey the face of the language.
So if I can paraphrase that, you haven't made a final decision yet, but you would say that it may pose difficulty for you to qualify woody biomass coming from federal lands given the...
It would certainly be challenging.
Given the statutory language. Okay. You have a number of requests for waivers of the mandate for a certain use of renewable fuels in the nation's transportation fuel supply. One prominent one coming from the governor of Texas, I think. And the statute says that you have 90 days from the receipt of that request for a waiver to either grant or deny the waiver. You received that, I think, at some point in April, did you not?
Just recently, within about the last week.
So toward the end of April, you would have received that?
Yes.
Will you be able to act within that 90-day period? Will you make that deadline?
Well, we're certainly making every attempt to comply with the dictate of the statute. As I mentioned, we will be going out very soon with a notice to offer up the public comment period that's also required in the legislation. Legislation says we should approve or deny within 90 days. Therefore, our contemplation is to have a 30-day public comment period attendant to the request from the state of Texas.
And so you're moving rapidly to put that public comment into effect, is that correct?
Yes, we are. There are certain delays in terms of getting things published in the Federal Register, and certainly we need to have the statutory public comment period to comply with the statute, but we're moving very quickly.
Okay. Well, we'll watch with interest your deliberations on that question and would encourage you to meet that 90-day deadline for making a decision. Under the 2007 law, there's a new life cycle greenhouse gas emission standard that applies to biofuels. And specifically, what it says is that for facilities for which the construction begins after the effective date of the law, meaning after December of last year, the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions for the fuels from that facility would have to be more beneficial than the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions that come from the petroleum that biofuel displaces. Now, obviously, the way that is structured, that better than petroleum carbon footprint would not apply to the corn-based ethanol refineries that either were in operation or under construction as of December of last year. And my question to you is, let's suppose that an owner of one of those refineries wanted to expand its size. Would that expansion be subject to the life cycle greenhouse gas emission requirements of the 2007 law?
That's one of the questions, sir, that we're looking at in the road ahead and looking at the provisions of the statute and implementation. I think basically your question is if a facility had a major modification, would that still count? And I think that's one of the issues we have not decided on. We've been talking to a lot of stakeholders, and certainly will be part of our discussion in the proposed rule.
And so you have that issue under consideration. All right, Mr. Meyers, that concludes my questions. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on the chairman's question as related to biomass. I know that the president in 2007, January, wanted to include an expansion of the RFS to include alternative fuels such as coal to liquid, something that Mr. Shimkus and Mr. Boucher have authored and I've co-sponsored. Compressed natural gas. Would the administration, do you think, be open now to an expansion of the RFS to include those two, in addition perhaps to the woody biomass? It just seems to me that they would be a good thing, at least from my perspective, to move forward.
Well, you're correct in terms of what the administration's bill included. It did include alternative fuels as otherwise defined in existing EPAC legislation. So that was the policy of the administration. I would say, as a general matter, the policy of the administration with respect to specific new legislation is something we would decide on a case-by-case basis through the interagency process. So I wouldn't be able to speculate, but certainly it was part of the administration's previous position.
Would there be, as you study this issue, including the woody biomass, is it something that you might be likely to come to a decision on within the next number of months?
I am sure that the administration would consider any legislation moving through Congress and be involved with the discussion with the committees of jurisdiction on this.
Now, EPA just reduced the ozone National Ambient Air Quality Standards. What are the ozone air quality impacts of large increases of ethanol and biodiesel consumption? Was that taken into consideration?
Well, our last analysis of that occurred when we promulgated the 2005 regulations based on the 2005 statute. What we showed was a mixture of effects based on the 7.5 billion gallons and some limited air quality modeling that we did to judge those effects. We saw some pollutants like particulates go down. We did see some increases in nitrous oxides, which are a precursor to ozone. They were not large on a great scale, but there were some increases in NOx from that modeling.
So it's somewhat of a negative reaction as it related to ozone.
We'll be refining our analysis on the new bill, on the basis of the new bill, analyzing that on a going forward basis. So that's one of the things we're looking at. Again, some other pollutants, some air toxics go down, as well as particulate matter, and other emissions like CO are also decreased. It depends. One thing to remember is that we have different fuels. We have ethanol, and then we also have biodiesel, which have different effects. And this bill also incentivizes directly biodiesel that the previous bill did not.
Now, has the EPA studied the requirements in the RFS in the context of the real world fuel availability, particularly as it relates to what the situation is today and what is coming forth in the legislation that the President signed?
We will be looking at things such as the energy security impact of the legislation on the U.S., which does involve an assessment of the global oil environment.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Upton. The gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Baldwin, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for your testimony today. I wanted to start by inquiring a little bit more about the process that EPA will be engaging in as you consider the waivers. Specifically, it's my understanding that EPA is going to evaluate whether full implementation of the RFS would severely harm the economy or environment of a state, region, or the United States in terms of your statutory directive under the Clean Air Act, and or whether there is an adequate domestic supply. And I'm kind of interested how you think you're going to define severe economic harm. And I know I'm asking you to anticipate the future and you'll have a lot of assessments and analysis, but what sort of factors will you be looking at? Will it be beyond the energy markets to the food price issues, et cetera? Please elaborate a little bit for me.
Sure. I first would want to clarify that we wouldn't be looking at full implementation of the RFS. Full implementation of the RFS generically would be in the year 2022. The waiver request we have right now is for essentially the current year, and has been filed under the previous 2005 law, since the new waiver authorities are not now effective under law. So we'll be looking at the more immediate effects, the effects cited in the governor's letter to EPA. As for the standard severe economic and environmental harm, that's a new standard that was first placed into the Clean Air Act in 2005 as part of that legislation. This will be a case of first impression for the agency. We do not have comparable standards within the Act for severe economic or environmental harm. So as far as I know, we've never interpreted that statutory standard before.
Well, I guess I'm looking ahead how you think you will be approaching that case of first impression in terms of those definitions.
That will be part. We'll be soliciting public comment on whether or not the information submitted to the agency would constitute severe economic harm. Which was the basis of a letter in front of us, was mostly economic. It was not. We did not receive information so far from the state of Texas regarding environmental issues directly, but we'll have to essentially give full faith and credit to the statute as written, and make a reasonable determination based on that language. As again, with cases of first impression, I'm very hesitant to project how the agency would interpret those terms.
Switching to a different topic, I'd really like to hear your assessment of the ability of advanced biofuel technologies to meet the timing and production volumes of the RFS mandate. And as we move to third generation technologies, I wonder what you see as the primary feedstocks for these technologies.
Well, a lot of work on this issue has been done by the Department of Energy, so I'm not as familiar with the research, but I think a lot of different feedstocks are being used and looked at in terms of cellulosic development, including things you hear quite a bit about switchgrass and the aforementioned forest thinnings. Different feedstocks would be readily available and essentially fit the profile for production, where you need to move a lot of mass to the facility. Most corn-based ethanol facilities now get most of their feedstock within about 30 miles or so from the facilities. So you need to have the feedstock available in the immediate facility and have transportation infrastructure to get there. So I think our impression too is that obviously things the private marketplace is looking at right now is using more than the kernel, using the other parts of the corn, the husk and the stalk and other things, and that may be the first penetration for non-kernel based ethanol. But I think we would be happy to provide more information for the record. We have the Office of Research and Development working on these issues, and I would greatly like to provide information from that office also.
Great. I see I'm almost out of time. You mentioned in the answer to that question concern about how far the feedstocks travel to the point of production. I have a real interest in, we had an amendment to the Energy Independence and Security Act relating to the adequacy of our transportation infrastructure to get the product to market after production. And I don't think I have a time to ask a question on that, but that is something that we really have to be vigilant about.
Yeah. And clearly, Congressman, if I have the opportunity, we are looking at those issues. It's one thing to look at the production and the capacity of the ethanol industry. It's quite another thing to look at the ability to blend it in all markets through the current transportation system and with the current economics of that.
Thank you very much, Ms. Baldwin. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. It's good to have you back, Mr. Meyer. Can the 9 billion gallon mandate in current law for renewable fuels be met this year?
Well, information in front of the agency would indicate that there's sufficient capacity to produce more than the $9 billion. The issue I think I referenced in the last question is transportation and blending. We are monitoring the situation right now. We don't have any information that would indicate that it will not be able to be met for this current
So
year.
you say it will be met?
I can't say definitely it will be met. I say we don't have any information now in front of the agency that would indicate.
If it's
it would
not met, do you have sufficient authority under law to grant waivers to alleviate the situation?
There's certainly a number of waivers. 2005 energy law, which you were very instrumental in, provided waivers, and additionally the new law provides additional waiver authority. There are also waiver authorities outside of the Clean Air Act that are applicable. Section 1541 of the Energy Bill that passed in 2005.
So the answer is yes?
Yes.
What's the definition that the EPA is using for a greenhouse gas to implement this bill?
The statute itself provides a definition of greenhouse gas as the 6 Kyoto gases plus any additional ones that the administrator finds would meet that definition.
What are the 6 Kyoto gases?
Well, broadly, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxides, and then we have the fluorinated gases, perfluorocarbon.
Water is not one of them, even though it's the most prevalent greenhouse gas?
Water is
Vapor.
not currently defined in the Kyoto Protocol or the statute.
So you don't have to consider water vapor?
No, we don't have to. We have the discretion under law to include other gases.
But water vapor is the most prevalent greenhouse gas.
Water vapor certainly has an effect on climate that's been documented by the IPCC in our own analysis, yes.
Okay. How does the EPA intend to model the requirement for life cycle greenhouse gas reductions? That's an artful term.
We've been working on this for some time, and most intensely in the last year. We've used a model developed initially by the Department of Energy, the GREET model. Essentially, we look at direct inputs into the production of the fuel, through a transportation system and the different processes involved in the production of the fuel in the infrastructure that's made. So it's a fairly complex model. It's been under development and revision for several years.
But will the EPA eventually create a mathematical model that is replicable?
Well, I believe the GREET model is replicable now, and I think it may be available publicly. I could check on that to be used by others. So the model itself is available.
But my point is, at some point in time, to implement the Act,
Right.
you have to have a way for ordinary people who are trying to conform to the Act, comply with it, to plug in production numbers and output numbers and compare apples to apples. In this case, emissions to emissions.
That's true. I think transparency is a part of the process we should keep in mind as we go forward, so our results are replicable. But the Act essentially contemplates that the agency will do the calculations and establish them through the regulations. Once they're established, then the law then further says they should be stable until there's essentially new methodology available. So we need to follow the provisions that.
Well, let me ask you a hypothetical. Under your definition of a greenhouse gas, you included methane. Cows emit methane.
Correct.
If rising corn prices result in fewer cows, that's a net reduction in methane. In your life cycle analysis, then, would that be considered a net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions?
Well,
we have the perverse effect of higher prices resulting in fewer cattle produced, which would, on paper, have the benefit of less methane being, so it would be mathematically a net improvement in greenhouse gas emissions.
There will be some challenges in interpreting the statute. I try to make those available. But we're essentially, Congressman, we're
I mean, it's not a frivolous question.
no, it's not at all. And we were charged with looking at both direct and indirect emissions. So.
My time has expired. I've got one final question. In the letter that Governor Perry sent to the EPA on April the 25th, he says that based on an expected average cost per bushel of corn in the Texas market in 2008 of $8 a bushel, that's going to have a negative impact to Texas cattle producers of almost $4 billion. Do you consider that to be severe economic harm?
Mr. Barton, that would be tantamount to my deciding the issue before we receive the public comment. So I would respectfully demur on the question. We will certainly take all the information Texas has provided us and analyze it and ask for the comment. Again, the standard itself is entirely new in the Clean Air Act, and we need to be respectful that we haven't interpreted it before.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Meyer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barton. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez, is recognized for a total of 8 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Meyers. Quickly, I'm going to reference what the ranking member was talking about. That's Governor Perry's letter. When it first came out, there was an article in the San Antonio paper, so I tried to figure out what exactly he's asking. What's the application? So the question comes down to how realistic a request it is. On page 2 of his letter, he says, "My request is for a waiver of 50% of the mandate for the production of ethanol derived from grain." But this is not Texas specific. You can't take this one state, segregate it from the others in reference to the nationwide mandate. I asked a question of my staff, and I believe the answer he got from someone, I'm not sure if it was with the department or agency, was that, no, you don't segregate Texas. It's a 50% request across the board mandate applicable to the United States. Is that the way you interpret it? I'm trying to figure out what he's asking.
The face of the request asked for 50% reduction, I think, in grain produced part of the mandate. I'm paraphrasing. Most of it is now satisfied by grain, although some other of the biodiesel might not fit in that category. But the waiver mechanism we're talking about refers back to the applicable volume, which is the national standard.
So what he's asking is basically maybe Texas specific as to the economic condition that it may rot, but the solution is a 50-state solution if applied. Would that be correct?
That's something we'll be also examining and looking for comment on. The Act is not entirely clear as to, although the effect can be at a subnational level. The way it was written in 2005, the governors can request it based on state, region, or the United States. Congress retained that in 2007 law while allowing further parties to also bring such a petition. But the effect can be more localized in the nation, but I guess the remedy refers back to the national standard.
Yeah. That's going to be tough. Now, you heard Mr. Upton make reference to a piece of legislation that I've joined him in sponsoring, and that is doing something about the mandates, a situation that occurs or is occurring, and specifically, let's say California that has a certain percentage limitation on the use of the ethanol blend. We're talking about now the refiners, the blend and such, not necessarily the transportation issue, which you've mentioned, which is huge. But nevertheless, you have waivers and such, but if you I'm not asking you to endorse and promote the piece of legislation, but really it has to deal with the carryover provision. You still will meet the targets at the end, but we extend the carryovers because the way they're written presently, it makes it almost impossible for the refiners to meet the mandate regarding the restrictions from certain states that are already in place. Even though they may be increasing the amounts of the ethanol blend, it still will not be in the way of timeliness in meeting the mandates. Is a legislative remedy one of those avenues rather than just what might be available in the way of waiver?
Well, as I mentioned, there are other waivers other than the one that was specifically the subject of the governor's, the state of Texas request. But referencing the availability of credits, the language from the 2005 Act, which limited credit life essentially to 12 months, remained in 2007. So we interpreted that in our 2005 regulations, and we're looking at again, but it's the same statutory language. So it's not an infinite credit life under the statute. So there are limitations in the statute as to how long the credit can be used between years.
And maybe I have to even look at the legislation more carefully, because I'm really thinking in terms of how specific we are when it comes over to the deficits only, not necessarily the credit scheme. What we're doing is we're extending the time to accumulate, obviously, deficits, but making them up towards the tail end when we're able to, when we have increased percentages that are allowed by states, and they have figured out the consequences of increasing the blends themselves, availability, and so on. So, but we look forward to some input from the agency.
We're aware of certain individual situations. I think with reference to California, we have talked to a refiner in California, and we'll continue to talk to individual refiners and others who find themselves in difficult situations under the statute.
And I was looking at your testimony because I think it was interesting that you're going to be taking into considerations emissions, air quality, greenhouse gases, water quality, land use, the economy, energy security, and all of that, which is an ongoing process, I guess, and it's one that I think some members of this committee and other members of Congress would agree that maybe we should have done a more careful analysis ourselves before we adopted the certain mandates. It seems to me that the President made mention of ethanol and the use of it in the State of the Union, and somehow we just adopted it as gospel, and we find ourselves where we are today without clearly looking at availability, consequences, and such. But again, thank you for your service, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gonzalez. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to be a little bit calmer in this round. Bob, it's welcome. I've got a couple questions. How many, and you may not know this answer, but it'll lead to other questions. How many gallons of refined product do we import in this country each day? Do you know?
How many gallons? I'm not sure. I mean, those numbers are usually in barrels. I think about, it's over half of our oil is imported at this stage.
Well, yeah, the numbers I have is about 3 million barrels of refined product that has been already refined overseas. Of that 3 million barrels of refined product at some refinery not on the continental United States, how much involvement does U.S. EPA have on the air quality of those refineries?
The refineries themselves, their jurisdiction obviously doesn't extend to Europe and other countries from where the gasoline comes from, but as to the product itself, it must meet U.S. specifications.
So the refineries that are producing product for our market being shipped here at 3 million barrels per day, there's no environmental standard on how that refined product meets the end standard for us to receive that product.
We currently don't attempt to enforce stationary source standards as against non-U.S. refineries. There's certain baselines that are applicable to foreign refineries with regard to their product, but again, it's a product focus.
Now, right now there are 147 ethanol plants with a capacity of 8.5 billion gallons. Do those currently have to meet air quality standards?
Yes, if they meet our major source definitions under the Act, they would need to meet PSD requirements.
So the ethanol refineries that we built because of the absence to build petroleum refineries here in this country are meeting a standard, but the imported product in the refinery process is not meeting any standard, because you have no jurisdiction overseas, correct?
Well, I would say that would be correct for traditional criteria air pollutants. There's an open issue going forward in the new statute as to the greenhouse gas standards and how...
Well, we're going to go there, so just hold on. There are 55 new plants under construction as well as 6 expansions underway. These expansions are already being built. These new ethanol refineries had to meet air quality standards and permitting to be able for construction to move forward. Is that correct?
Yes, they would need to meet applicable standards. Again, any particular standard or refinery may vary depending on how it's constructed, what it's fired with.
So hopefully between the next 9 to 12 months, when we have 13.6 billion gallons of refined product of ethanol base to add to our fuel mix, they'll be under refinery standards that we support. Let me move real quick. It's very curious that this debate is revolving around severe economic harm. You were here a couple weeks ago. We talked about carbon dioxide, and that based upon the Massachusetts case, yours will be whatever the legal terminology is, habitat and all this other stuff, but it will not be involved with economic harm.
That's correct. I think...
so we're gonna debate economic harm for a product grown, produced, refined in this country and discourage the production of that, but we're not going to be involved through your process of economic harm and carbon dioxide.
The endangerment language that was the subject of Mass v. EPA talks to endangerment, public health, or welfare.
And I think that's, you know, the USA Today from May 1st, China leaves U.S. in dust as the #1 carbon dioxide offender. National Journal from 3 May on India, envy yes, green no. That's this whole carbon debate. You know, they're not going to comply. We're going to have all this pain and no gain. I'll end up with, again, the debate on that the chairman supports is the alternative fuel standard. What the president announced in the State of the Union was an alternative fuel standard, not an RFS. RFS was part of the alternative fuel standard. If we had moved to an alternative fuel standard with some air regulatory guidelines, if we had built a coal-to-liquid refinery, would they have had to be permitted and blessed by you all as having met the environmental air standards?
Any new facility built in the United States is subject to permitting on the construction if it breaches major source thresholds and would need an operational Title V permit.
Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, thank you for your diligence. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shimkus. The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Ross, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Meyers. Thank you for being here with us today. I want to discuss biodiesel. The biodiesel industry tells me that we already produce 500 million gallons of biodiesel, and that they know how to keep track of it under EPA's current tracking system. With that said, can you explain the reason why the diesel fuel requirement of 500 million gallons of biomass-based diesel cannot be required in 2009 as directed by Congress?
That is one of the issues we've had discussions with the industry on. What we're dealing with right now is a transition between the 2005 law and the new 2007 requirements. For 2008, the current year, there was a provision that allowed us to effectively change just the applicable volume, raising it to 9 billion gallons, but retain the current regulatory program. We need to make a transition to a new regulatory program to implement the new law. We are moving on that, but 2009 is a year which is very tight for us to meet, to have all the regulations in place.
So it's not that they can't produce it, it's that y'all can't do the paperwork with it?
Well, we are trying to look at ways we can accommodate the interests of the industry, and certainly we're paying attention to the statute and the regulatory schedule that Congress laid out for us. I would just reference after 2005 law, we moved very aggressively. It still took us 18 months to put together both proposed and final regulations. So the law was passed in last December, and having it all in final form before January 1st of 2009 is an extremely short time period.
So Congress has mandated 500 million gallons of biomass-based diesel fuel. The industry says they're already producing it, and that they know how to keep track of it under your current EPA tracking system. And yet, we can pass a law, and the folks in the industry can figure out how to make 500 million gallons of biomass-based diesel, and yet y'all can't figure out how to track it and do the paperwork on it by the time prescribed by Congress?
Well, it's not a matter of us just deciding. We will need to propose that as part of our regulations, take public comment, and then go final. It makes most sense to do as much as we can, as fast as we can, but we have to do it in a manner, given the enormity of the mandate and given the importance of the economic issues, we have to do that in a very thoughtful manner. So one of the directives the administrator tried to implement was a massive, I don't say massive, a very robust outreach program. We're talking to a lot of stakeholders, including National Biodiesel Board and others, to try to look at these issues and try to see if there's flexibility to address them. I would say we're working in faith, and we'll continue to do that. But it is a very tight time frame to get final regulations.
Well, I would hope that the EPA would respect the wishes and the legislation passed by Congress and be able to figure out how to do the paperwork and the rules and regs, given the fact that the industry has certainly adhered to the legislation, and they've got the ability to meet the new requirements. I would hate to see us see even higher diesel prices and see us continue to increase our dependence on foreign oil simply because a federal agency couldn't put in place a tracking system, the rules and regs, and in the time frame that was prescribed by Congress. And I just want to bring that to your attention and urge that you work with us so that we got a lot of challenges with ethanol right now, and there's been a lot said about that, but with biomass-based diesel, we don't have nearly the controversy we have over ethanol. It can reduce our dependence on foreign oil. It can reduce the price that my truckers and farmers pay at the pump, and I think it's very critical that the EPA be able to figure out how to do their part of this equation, just as the folks in the biodiesel industry have figured out how to do theirs, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ross. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Sullivan, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Meyers. The Energy Independent Security Act allows EPA to make assessments on cellulosic production and adjust the mandate's volumes downward if it makes a determination there won't be enough production to meet the requirements of the bill. However, EPA has until 30 days before the year a required volume of cellulosic is supposed to start before making this determination. This doesn't give refiners much lead time. Is EPA considering making this production determination sooner to help ease this potential supply problems?
We're willing to look at any permissible constructions. One thing that the statute provides, however, is that we rely on the estimates of EIA, the Energy Information Administration, in looking at the projections. They're required under law to make those projections at a certain time period. So, and we need to look at those under the statute. So it's the timing that was contemplated by the statute, would be my response, but we'll be happy to look at any flexibilities there might be.
So you would be willing to look at flexibilities?
I'd be happy to look at the matter. Again, we're required on an annual basis to look at EIA's projections. EIA's projections are essentially done in the fall for the next coming year, so that's where the timing frame came from.
Okay. And also following up on Congressman Barton's question, and could biofuels increase greenhouse gas emissions on a life cycle basis, including indirect factors and land use change?
Could any particular biofuel
Yes.
be a net GH? I think it's theoretically possible.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sullivan. We have two members on the Democratic side who are members of the full committee, not members of the subcommittee, who have joined us here, and we will welcome questions from them. We also have a recorded vote pending on the floor, and our goal will be to try to fit in both sets of questions prior to recessing for that vote. First, I'll recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to waive on the subcommittee for this hearing, because renewable fuels is important to where I come from in Houston, Texas, and fuels itself. Section 1505 of the Energy Policy Act of 2005 directed the EPA to perform a study and provide Congress with a report on public health, air quality, and water resource impacts of fuel additive substitutes for MTBE, which today is almost exclusively made by ethanol. And has this report been completed?
The 1505 report has not presently been completed. I think we are scheduled to do that fairly soon and have that report available.
Okay, do you have any kind of idea when we might be able to see that? I think that would help us in making some of the decisions.
I will provide, I'll be happy to follow up. I was under the impression we may have that as early as next month.
Okay. Do you think it's wise for Congress or the administration to support a vast increase in renewable fuel standard before the basic public health, air quality, and water quality impact studies of ethanol are completed?
If the question was whether it was wise for Congress to do something.
To do something before we see that results of your report?
Congressman, I worked here for 23 years, so I respectfully would respect the judgment of Congress.
Okay. Well, we appreciate that, but at least as one member, I'd like to see what the report says before we increase basically from ethanol. Do you have any idea what the report might conclude?
No, I do not. We'd be happy to follow up for the record and verify our timing, but we certainly are mindful of the studies that were passed in 2005, as well as the new requirements in the 2007 law.
Okay. The RFS includes requirements or studies of various aspects of biofuels. These studies include assessing the RFS impacts on feed, grains, livestock, food, forest products, and energy industry, and its environmental and resource conservation impacts. If the results of these studies were found negative and harmful impacts on the industries or to the environment, does the bill require the EPA administrator to adjust the mandate to prevent these unintended consequences?
I do not believe the bill would require the administrator. The administrator, on his own motion, is able under the 2007 statute to initiate a waiver process.
Okay. Do you believe it would be beneficial for the EPA to have the authority to alter the mandate RFS levels in order to prevent any unintended consequences if the results of these or other studies are found negative impacts on our public health, environment, or the economy?
I would demur on any legislative changes to the current statute since the administration has not taken position on any bill yet.
Mr. Chairman, thank you again for your time and for allowing me to wave on, and appreciate the courtesy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Green. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Stupak, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding this hearing. I've been pestering you to have this hearing because I'm really concerned about the renewable biomass definition as the trees and residues from tree plantations on non-federal lands cleared prior to enactment. So I have a number of questions along those lines, if I may. Regarding the renewable biomass definition of bill, what are the roadblocks do you see in enforcing it? How are you going to enforce this to make sure that it does not come from federal lands?
That is something that we are currently examining, and we're aware of situations where the mill or a facility might not know, where exactly what one tree came from or another tree came from. But we would, in situations where the statute would propose difficulties, we would have to exercise some judgment and rule of reason and interpret the statute in a way that we thought could be workable. And
Well, I was on the 205 Energy conference report and trying to get this, and when one of them who insisted on having timber and trees be part of our ethanol solution here, we never dreamed it would be sitting here saying, did this log come from a state forest or federal land or a private land? That's insane. How about, do you have you had any discussions how this would be enforced? Would the requirement of enforcement be on the production facility, cellulosic production facility, or on the logger? The only one who's going to know where the wood came from is the logger, and when they're going down the road, believe me, all logging trucks around my district, we don't know if they're state, federal, where they're coming from.
We have not reached determination on those issues since we were at the proposal stage. That will afford us the opportunity to take comment with regard to various compliance options, but we need to deal with the statute we have and interpret it to the best we can.
Well, I have a couple of entrepreneurs looking at my district right now to make significant improvements in developing ethanol from cellulosic, from timber. Can you give us any time frame in which you might clarify this so we know how it's going to be enforced, or what is the enforcement mechanism? So I want to make sure they can move ahead with their investment, private investment that they're trying to make in an area such as mine.
Yeah, we are moving ahead. Again, we've been talking to a lot of stakeholders and doing the type of analysis we need to do. Our intent is to have the proposed rule out and available, obviously, in the Federal Register this fall, early this fall, is our projection right now.
All right, well, let me ask you this. You mentioned in your testimony that'll be important to work with the U.S. trade representatives so that you're meeting your international obligations. Explain that in more detail, could you? What is the international concerns here?
In application of the language of the statute, we're dealing with both domestically produced and imported product. So the standards are applicable to the product and its life cycle, direct and indirect inputs. So we would need to look at and consult with the USTR and others as to any regulations to implement that to make sure they were consistent with U.S. treaty requirements.
Okay, well, in my district, I border Canada, and we move timber all the time back and forth for production of paper and other things. How would you enforce this provision here on trees or residues from tree plantation on non-federal lands if the wood came from Canada?
I have not thought of that question, sir, and would be happy to provide it for the record.
All right. I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman. I hope we can pass the HRSA bill and get this thing resolved. You can see all the nightmare this provision would provide, especially for those of us who have a timber-based economy. And as we're trying to move cellulosic properties of timber to make it into ethanol, it's impossible to enforce the provisions set forth. So with that, I yield back the balance of my time. I thank the gentleman for his time and for his forthright answers.
I thank the